Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this video on the Islamic dilemma, where we have yet another person, another Dawah guy, who I haven't heard of before. There's a new Dawah guy, he's up and coming. He's trying to learn the ropes, try to figure out how to respond to the big questions like, does your Quran accidentally confirm the Christian scripture, the Jewish scripture, even non-scriptural things? Does it confirm all of these things as being divinely inspired and also contradicting them in its very own text? That is the Islamic dilemma, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell. For those of you who are new, there's an argument that is made in religious circles when it comes to talking about Christianity and Islam in particular, but really it's just focused on Islam, looking at what the Quran actually says, and then following that through in a consistent and holistic way. And you end up with accepting the Quran says that the many books of the Bible, the Torah and the Gospel in particular, are from Allah, they're from God, they're inspired, they're preserved, they're authoritative, they have truth in them, they are not corrupt, they're not false or anything like that. But at the same time, the Quran then goes on to contradict the very thing it just affirmed. It contradicts the Gospel and the Torah that supposedly Allah also sent, because Allah sent the Quran and the Gospel and Torah, but they say totally different things. So how do Muslims solve this dilemma, this paradox, this Rubik's Cube of a puzzle that just doesn't seem to have any answer? Well, let's check out this guy and his response. I'm sure, I haven't actually watched this yet, but I'm sure that he's going to have some amazing stuff that I've never heard of ever, and it's not going to be a copy and paste of a certain guy from Libya and a certain Hannah Fontana. But we will see. Let's dive straight into it.
Now, let us define the Islamic dilemma in simple terms. The Quran confirms the Bible, and at the same time, the Quran contradicts the Bible, therefore Islam is false. Now, what does the Quran mean when it speaks about the Torah and the Gospel? So we don't believe that the term Torah, when used in the Quran, is univocal. The term Torah in the Quran can refer to two things. It can refer to which was originally revealed to Moses, peace be upon him, or the Torah that the Jews have. Same thing for Gospel. It can refer to the original Gospel, which was revealed to Christ, peace be upon him, or the Gospel.
Okay, so first problem. So immediately the way he's trying to set this up is there's multiple Torahs and there's multiple Gospels, and this is actually becoming a little bit more popular lately. But one of the Islamic ways of dealing with this is just to say that whenever the Quran confirms the Torah and says it's preserved, inspired, authoritative, from Allah, has truth, and then contradicts it, well, we resolve this by saying, okay, well actually there's two Torahs, or maybe more, who knows? But there's two Torahs, there's two Gospels, and the Quran, without telling you and without making it explicit and without giving you any context or any kind of an instruction to go by, just switches between the different Torahs and the different Gospels at will, without saying, and without making it obvious, and without there being context. And there's nothing in the Quran that tells you it's doing this. There's nothing in the Quran that tells you that there are multiple Torahs or multiple Gospels. You just have to believe there are, because that will help. Now, given that there is nothing in the Quran that says this, there is nothing in the Quran that even hints at this. In fact, I would actually argue it makes the Quran author basically the most unclear, unintelligent author possible, which is bizarre that they want to go through this incredibly uncharitable view, whereas the Islamic dilemma actually assumes a charitable view from the get-go. Is basically because they just want to use sophistry to get out of this, and they want to obfuscate, which is why they're introducing multiple Torahs and multiple Gospels, even though there's nowhere in the Quran that says this or hints at this, or even really, I'd say, even allows for this. But you see, it's easily refuted anyway, because at all of the points in the Quran where he wants to try and insert this, oh, no, this is the original Torah, not the current one, or this is the original Gospel, the uncorrupted one given to Isa, that is Jesus in their context, not the one that you currently have in Muhammad's time, they're going to want to shift between these two when it's convenient for them, because there are certain verses that make it absolutely clear that this is a confirmation. In fact, there's 18 of them that use the Arabic word musaddiqun in the context of confirming the scriptures that Christians and Jews have before them. The problem that he's going to have is that there are specific words used and expressions used in context of the word musaddiqun that are not talking about Mabayna yadehi, so confirming what is between their hands, but rather confirming specifically what is with them. And of course, the context here is Muhammad's time, because Muhammad is usually the one that is speaking. If not him, it's Allah or it's some other person, which means that it's affirming what the Gospel and Torah are as being true revelations from God in the 7th century at the time of Muhammad. So trying to swap them out doesn't work because the Quran clearly confirms what is with you in your time. So that doesn't work. Shocker, ladies and gentlemen, I know. Who would have thought that you can't just magically make something that is discussed as a singular noun and just assume it means multiple? When the historical context isn't there, when it makes the author incredibly, in all honesty, dumb, because he couldn't convey that to you. He couldn't tell you there was multiple Torahs. He could only tell you there's one Torah and just hope you figured out that he actually meant multiple. I find that just massively disingenuously uncharitable, frankly.
Now, the Christian argument is that the Quran confirms the Bible. Because the Quran, for example, Quran chapter 2, it says confirming which is with them, confirming the Torah and the Gospel, for example. So what does the Quran mean when it says confirming which is with them? Yes, it does confirm the scriptures in possession of the Jews and the Christians in the 7th century Arabia. Wait, Fawzi, you just admitted that the Quran confirms the Bible.
That was literally my whole point, that you can't make that argument by swapping out one Torah for a different hypothetical Torah, one Gospel for a different hypothetical Gospel, because the Quran is very clear that it's confirming what is present with them. So at least he acknowledges and he's aware of this. At least we've got some movement here somewhere.
Not so fast. We believe that this confirmation that the Quran makes is not an absolute, complete confirmation. We believe it's a general confirmation.
And ladies and gentlemen, we should have a little game of bingo at this point. Whenever someone brings up the Islamic dilemma, they are always going to bring up general confirmation, conscious edits, sarcasm, like genuinely, seriously, if you go long enough, they'll start saying things are sarcastic. We should be just playing bingo day in, day out when it comes to the Islamic dilemma. And yes, he has landed on the most common one, general confirmation, which is silly because I've pointed this out many times to people, but no one's actually bothered in the Dawah scene to like look into this. But general is not the same as specific. Specific is what you do when you confirm some of something, but not all of it. You're just confirming a specific subset of something, right? If I confirmed the first page of a book, but not the other page, then I would be making a specific confirmation, not a general confirmation. The Dawah guys genuinely don't understand this, which is why the very thing that they're using is a massive English blunder to begin with. It's not even grammatically correct what they're saying, but they keep saying it, and I'm like, all right. No one's going to take you seriously if you can't even do basic English when you make your argument. But all right, fine, we'll call it general confirmation. So they're going to say, actually, when the Quran confirms all these different things, even though it never specifies what, it doesn't qualify as to what it's confirming other than the scripture itself. It doesn't say just this chapter, just this book, just this part, just this half, not this half. No. It just says it confirms the scriptures. And it never qualifies. So if it doesn't qualify, then the way that works in normal language is, well, if he didn't mean the whole thing, we would have expected the person to have qualified and said just this bit. But because he doesn't, the normative way you'd understand that is, well, he's referring to the whole thing then. In a similar way, if I went up to a Muslim and I said, I believe in the Quran, and I never qualified that statement, the normal Muslim across the entire planet would assume, unless I said otherwise, I believe in the whole Quran in an absolute total sense, not in a specific sense, where I only believe in one chapter but not all these other chapters, because that would be silly and it's not the normal way that belief is expressed. But anyway, ignoring this, they're going to argue that somehow allowing for general or specific confirmation allows them to accept some specific things as confirmed but not other specific things as confirmed. So only some things are confirmed, not all things. Let's see if he talks about this a little bit more before I respond further to that insane point.
It's a partial confirmation. In other words, the Quran is confirming the altered previous scriptures because they contain truths within them. Now, Fawzi, it doesn't say general confirmation. It says confirming. Well, it also doesn't say absolute confirmation. Now, where did I get that general confirmation? I understood that the Quran is making a general confirmation because I read the Quran in its entirety. I understood what the author of the Quran believes regarding the previous scriptures.
He says that he's read the whole Quran entirely and this is like a holistic method he's applying. That's not true. If he was, he would be on the same side that I am and be saying the same thing I am. Fortunately, he's stuck in the theological position he's in and he can't admit he's wrong.
When we read the Quran, we understand that the author of the Quran consciously corrects the previous scriptures.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have the second point. We have conscious edits. Finally, the second bingo term has come up now. I need to make a little bingo thing. Conscious edits is basically when you just double down that someone couldn't possibly have made a mistake, and so they must have been intentional no matter how bizarre and basically just silly it would be. It's a bit like when your friend tells you they can dance and they start dancing and then they fall over and they land on their butt and they just do they just land in a pose so it looks like it was intentional. And then they expect you to buy it and be like, see, this is just part of the routine. But in reality, they've just failed miserably and they're trying to cover up for their mistakes. And this is kind of what this is, but to an even bigger level, because this isn't dancing. This isn't your mate at a wedding reception. This is an entire religion. So now that they're going to do this with an entire religion, it basically looks like whenever the Quran affirms our scriptures, but then contradicts in the same book, in the same way, in the same sense, it must be so bad and so obviously silly that the author would ever do this, that they must be doing it intentionally for some other purpose. And the purpose they give is the idea that the author is actually God and that he's trying to fix the previous scriptures by referring to them, but then making deviations and changes, additions, deletions, and so on, when he wants to correct them, right? He's like a teacher, like he's marking some homework. That's wrong. Let me just write in the correct answer, write it in red so you guys can see, kind of thing. The issue is, in the context of a teacher, obviously you know what the teacher's doing, right? You know that's the agreed upon method of what you will do. You'll write homework, they'll mark it, and they'll write it in a different color, they'll give you a grade. This is an entire religious text that doesn't say this, doesn't start off with this premise, doesn't have this assumption. He's reading this into it out of pure desperation because he's just realized his religion is fundamentally incoherent as he understands it. And this is a problem that has been around for years now, and there's no real answer to it. And in the wake of the internet, it gets a lot more difficult, right? It gets a lot more challenging when you're just bombarded with this problem and people keep saying, look, you need to solve this at some point. And they keep dragging their feet, keep coming up with, hey, look over there. But eventually, you have to give a response, and it leads to things like this. So, according to this guy, and basically all of the intellectuals, so to speak, in this debate space who are trying to resolve this, they say conscious edits. The Quran author is God. So, first of all, it's circular because it assumes that the author is God, which is the very thing we're trying to prove. Because if the Islamic dilemma goes through, the author cannot be God by definition, or at least as theists we would understand that. He is assuming it's God. He's assuming the author is all-knowing. He's assuming the author has the ability to know the original revelation and to also be in a position to correct it, meaning that this theory can't even work with a human being, because otherwise it allows for the possibility of mistakes, and they're trying to avoid the whole conversation of mistakes, because mistakes are awkward and icky, so they're just going to say it's God, right? Okay, just accept it's God, right? That's the whole point. Just accept it, don't ask questions, become a Muslim. So once you've got on this, they're going to give some examples. Actually, I think he's almost certainly going to give an example, and it's going to be hilarious, but let's keep watching.
And since the author of the Quran corrects the previous scriptures, we can conclude from that the author of the Quran does not believe that everything in the previous scriptures are from God or authoritative.
Okay, do you hear what he said there? He said, because the Quran author is correcting the previous scriptures. Now, no, he isn't. This is basically where they shove in the Trojan horse. They're hoping you don't notice what he's just done there. What he's done is he's stepped too far. Rather than saying the Quran author clearly knows a lot about Jewish and Christian stories that are found in the Bible, which is true, he obviously does, because he's telling them orally, he jumps from this position to actually no, he intimately understands the actual text itself. And the reason they say that is because they need for the author to know all things. Remember, conscious edits, the author is God, so he has to know everything, right? He has to know what all the corruptions have been in the biblical text. He has to be able to be in a position to know how to fix them in order for him to be a conscious editor, which I absolutely hate. So that means he has to not just know the story, he has to know what's actually written in the actual text that the Christians and Jews hold. What is written in the Torah, textually. What is written in the Gospel, textually. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The issue is there is no reason to think he does. In fact, all of the evidence, people like Sidney Griffith, who sadly passed away quite recently, rest in peace, Sidney Griffith, he wrote in his book, The Bible in Arabic, he makes the argument that the Bible wasn't available in Arabic at the time of Muhammad. It was only later that it was actually translated into Arabic from Greek or Aramaic or Hebrew. So that means that there isn't actually a text that exists in Muhammad's time for him to even be aware of. Anyway, he would have to have someone else translate it for him. Second point to remember is that according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad is illiterate. He's an Ummi prophet, so he's illiterate, at least how they understand the word. So if he's illiterate, then I don't really think he can be intimate with the text anyway. Now they're of course going to be like, well, hold on, that's an assumption. You're assuming it's Muhammad. You can't do that. Well, that's fine, but you need to understand that I think this is just more evidence that the author was human, precisely because the author who was reciting it couldn't read, which explains the third point. Third point being that there is no, or very few at least, direct quotes in the Quran that pertain to be from either the Torah or the Gospel. So there's arguably one, which is actually a quotation from the Psalms, but everything else is loose paraphrases. And when we look at those and we acknowledge that they're actually loose paraphrases, the best way to explain this is that the author is more familiar with oral recitation and through stories, ultimately, he heard traditions and he absorbed them, than he is through written texts. Because if he was familiar with written texts, he would be able to quote them verbatim because he's seen and read the texts, presumably quite a few times. This is the best way of explaining why the Quran doesn't have pretty much any direct quotations in it. Now, that evidence is overwhelming. You are going to really struggle to find any good reasons to think that the Quran author knows the text, because he simply refuses to quote it. Because conscious edits requires the author to be all-knowing, aka it's circular, it requires the author to be God to even have his theory, it requires that he knows the written text. So it's all circular, and it isn't even warranted anyway. The evidence points in totally the opposite direction. But they'll never address this because they can't, basically. That's it. And I'd be amazed if he ever does, but let's continue.
Another clear example, this is actually one of my favorite examples, which is Moses and the cloak. In Quran chapter 20, verse 22, God tells Moses to draw his hands into his sides, and that when he puts his hand in his sides, it will come out white. This is a miracle. Now the verse does not stop there. After the Quranic verse says that Moses' hands will come out as white, it says also that his hand will come out with no disease. Now nothing in the context speaks about anything about disease. Then why did Allah say that when Moses will take out his hand, it will come out with no disease? Actually, we see that in Exodus 4:6, the same story is there. God tells Moses to put his hand in his side and that his hands will come out as white. But in Exodus 4:6, in the Bible, it says that his hand will come out, or it came out with disease. Wait a second. So the Bible says that Moses' hands went out with disease, and we see later the Quran correcting this and says that Moses, when he took his hands out of his side, it came out without disease. This is a clear correction of the previous scriptures.
So this is really strange, and Muslims are obsessed with this example, but it's like one of the worst examples you could give, because honestly, I watched what you just saw, and I got the impression, I don't think he's actually read the Exodus account, so I don't think he knows that part of the sign of the 3 signs that Moses is given, the third sign, he puts his hand in his cloak, takes it out, it's disease, he puts his hand in, and he takes it out, and it's healed. I don't think he knows the story. It continues to literally quote the bit that the Quran says. I think he has the impression that the biblical account is the sign is just he puts his hand in and now it's covered in disease, and that's the sign. Which is hilariously funny to me that he thinks that. There's a good chance he thinks that. I think he does, based on the way he phrased it. But obviously we know that the full sign is that he puts his hand back in and takes it out and the hand is clear of any disease, which is exactly what the Quran says. So to me, I think the Quran is just summarizing this from the biblical account. I don't even think that this is even a candidate for conscious edits. I just don't think that even goes that far. Some of you might disagree. No worries whatsoever. The point, however, is that this is hardly some kind of evidence for conscious edits. It's just evidence for either a few things. One, the author wasn't trying to just summarize the Exodus account and instead just got it wrong. Two, he was trying to summarize the account, and that's all he's doing, in which case there's no problem anyway. 3, if he is consciously editing, do you not think this would be a great time to explain that's what he's doing? Instead of having it be a secret code that you have to decipher? In fact, my question to Muslims would just be, how do you know that the putting the hand in and taking out and it became leprous was not actually a thing? Because the Quran doesn't deny it, it just doesn't include it. But not inclusion is not the same as the Quran denying, and no Quranic scholar is going to tell you that. They're going to say, no, just because the Quran doesn't mention something doesn't mean it's denying it. But either way, this doesn't help. It's just a really weird example that they insist on giving you time and time and again for conscious edits. What just significant, absolutely killer reason do we have to reject the idea of conscious edits? And you can read more about this idea in my book. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for the plug of the Islamic Dilemma. Available now on Amazon as a hardback, a paper copy, or an ebook, Kindle ebook. It has a foreword by Dr. David Wood, one of the people promoting the Islamic Dilemma since the 90s. In the book, I make the case that there are clearly parallels the Quran has with contemporary stories available in Arabia. So, for example, Surah 12, Surah Yusuf, chapter in the Quran that is, for the most part, just about the story of Joseph, is clearly engaging with contemporary Syriac homilies that have existed actually like a century or two before Muhammad even came around. But these stories, these homilies of the story of Joseph, which are not the same as found in the Genesis record, this is not the same as what we see in Genesis 37, for example, but they are laymanized versions. They're something that is simplified, easier to give in a sermon to quickly express the meaning of the Joseph story. And often this was done by Syriac bishops from the Church of the East. So this would have been often with typology in mind. So they would have been contrasting Joseph with a kind of Jesus later on. The Quran author is responding to those versions of the story. We can tell this through a whole ton of different metrics. I go through quite a few in my book. You can actually grab Gabriel Said Reynolds' not his latest book, because he just released a new one. Wait, do I have that book? Yes, I do. You can grab Gabriel Said Reynolds' book, and he will go through it in here, and he will point out the relevant research. He actually quotes Joseph Whitstone and Charbel Risk. You can find those two academics just by Googling them, and Google their names, Joseph Whitstone and Charbel Risk, the story of Joseph, something like that, and you'll find their papers. I actually quote from them in my book as well, because ultimately, and this is what it boils down to, if the Quran author is engaging with other stories, there can't possibly be candidates for the original story given to Moses, for example, then the Quran cannot possibly be trying to re-reveal the original that was given to Moses. Simply because you can't do two things at once. You can't be influenced from a story that can't possibly go all the way back to Moses and simultaneously be revealing the true story that does go back to Moses. You can only pick one or the other. I suppose you can kind of blend them, so you have elements of one and elements of the other, but then that doesn't solve the problem because, well, you're still going to have contradictions and you're not consciously editing them anymore. And I want you to understand this as well. If a conscious edit is wrong, even in just one place where there's a contradiction between the Quran and the Gospel of the Torah, that means that the theory of conscious edits has failed to do its job. They need conscious edits as a blanket term to cover all contradictions. You show that that doesn't happen in one instance, it's like a tower of cards that falls over. It's a completely redundant theory. It makes the Quran author into a laughingstock who cannot communicate properly, who puts secret codes in his own religious text and expects people 1,400 years later on YouTube to find it. I find that personally insulting to the author of the Quran, whoever that may be. I think a charitable reading of the Quran is simply to say, no, he actually did mean the Torah and the Gospel. He really did affirm them and believe that they are from Allah, because he would know if you take the Quranic account, because he's the one who gave them, according to that view. But Muslims are increasingly having to come up with less charitable, more insulting ways of getting out of the dilemma. And, you know, if they want to do that, that's fine. I think Muslims can make their own mind up. They can look at this and say, okay, which one of us is actually presenting the Quran author more appropriately, more closely to what he's actually intending? Or is one of us taking some, actually not just one theory, but multiple other theories and cramming it into the text to try to save a theological belief in Sunni Islam? I think that's pretty clear.
The crucifixion is a major Christian belief, and it's all over the Gospels. The Quran comes and corrects this and says Jesus was not crucified.
Just a real quick thing. You notice what he did there? He's going to give another example. He's going to talk about the crucifixion. This is another one they love to go to because, again, this is the principle of the Quran author could not have been so stupid as to have made an error, that he must have intentionally done this for a point. And they use rhetoric to try to get this across to you, because if you don't use rhetoric, it just looks dumb. So let me just break this down. He's basically saying, look, in the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all over the place you see about Jesus' crucifixion. I actually don't think he's read this, but you know, he's wise enough to have copied from the correct Dawah script that has figured out that the Christian gospels do actually say that Christ was crucified all over the place. It's kind of the big summarizing point, not the ultimate, but one of the big points in Jesus' ministry. But yeah, so it's all over the place, he's going to say, right? And what he wants you to accept is there's no way a reasonable person could deny it. That's what he's leading up to. Because he wants you to think, if no reasonable person could deny it, and Muhammad clearly knew about the Jewish and Christian stories, then he would have known about the crucifixion, so why on earth did he deny it? Unless it was intentional. It was a big 4D chess move by the Quran author to tell Muhammad, no, this was actually not what was going on. The crucifixion, that was just made up. It was a big illusion. People were tricked into becoming Christians, mushrikun Christians apparently, which was Allah's plan because reasons. But again, this just shows a ignorance of history and basically just an ignorance to do any more digging. Historically, there have always been lots of different positions about the crucifixion precisely because there have always been lots of different kind of groups that wanted to understand who Jesus is and they took their own view. So for example, the Docetists. There are people that actually denied that Christ was in flesh. He wasn't actually human. He was merely a spirit or a phantom that had been projected into this world that appeared to be human, but in reality he wasn't. So when he went to the cross, nothing human actually died there. It was, again, pantomime. It was just looking like he was. And this was their way of dealing with the theological concerns about, well, how do you reconcile Jesus being God, for example? They just took the hard choice of, well, we'll just deny basically the incarnation. Now, of course, this was quickly condemned and never became the orthodox position, but it is interesting that even early on, you do have these kinds of positions. And this has led many people to speculate whether or not the Quran takes a similar view. I don't think it does. I think the Quran is actually very clear in Surah 4, so Surah An-Nisa, ayah 157. And when it talks about the Jews boasting that they killed the Messiah, this text is not written to me or to any Christian. The author, from the context, reading verses before and after, is very clear. This is for the Jews. That makes no sense at all. If you genuinely think that this is meant to be a refutation of the Christian position, why would you reference Jews and direct the refutation at Jews when Jews are not the people who go around talking about Jesus being crucified? The rabbinic Jews have no interest in that. It's not part of their religion. They don't care about it. It's not something they teach. It's not a doctrine. It's not anything. But it is the very center doctrine of the Christian faith. So to suggest that when the Quran is not aiming those words at Christians but to Jews, that tells me something. And it tells me that it's denying Jews the power for them to mock Christians, saying that they killed the Messiah. It has nothing to do with denying the actual event itself, but merely it denies their perception in thinking that they were successful in killing Jesus, the person who claimed to be the Messiah, from the Jewish point of view, rabbinic Jewish point of view. And this is basically where critical scholarship will get you. And if you're a Sunni, you can't get out of this, so you have to believe in really weird, convoluted ways of understanding the crucifixion. But this is kind of his argument anyway. He's going to say, look, it's so obvious, everyone believes it, therefore, how could someone accidentally get this wrong? No, it's not that they accidentally could have got this wrong. It's perfectly reasonable, actually, that he could have heard conflicting views. Perhaps he came across some 7th century Docetist-like group, but there are many different views you can take here that's not the Sunni one. In fact, I think the Sunni one is probably the least likely to be true one, and for that reason, it's just really embarrassing when Muslims bring it up, because it's so easy to knock down and just to keep going and keep pushing it to its limits, and it just tears apart into basically, well, I don't know why the Quran says this, I just agree that the crucifixion never happened.
The Old Testament says that Solomon disbelieved by God. The Quran comes and says Solomon never disbelieved.
He brought up Solomon's sin of committing polytheism, of adhering himself or yoking himself to polytheism through his wives. And it says, look, the Quran corrects this. Okay, great. Problem though. The Quran could have corrected this for a whole plethora of different ways that don't imply that he's actually trying to re-reveal the original, which is what they mean when they say. This is exceptionally embarrassing because the Quran doesn't address so many of the past, for us often patriarchs, but for the Muslims they're actually prophets. It takes the prophets from an Islamic point of view, like Lot, like Abraham, like Moses, so on, and it never clears them of any of their sins. So to point at Solomon and say, look, Solomon was cleared of this one sin, therefore all the sins have been cleared, is ridiculous. The Quran says over and over again, pretty clearly, that every prophet basically has done some kind of sin, and even Muhammad in Surah 48, Ayah 2, is guilty of having done sins. It's bizarre to me that anyone would make this argument, because the Quran makes it absolutely clear the doctrine of Isma is not found in the Quran whatsoever. In fact, the total opposite is found in the Quran. Abraham lies. Moses kills a guy and then blames the devil. And the way that they have to reinterpret this is basically like, no, it's another thing. It's not. These verses that are immediately after each other are not connected. Like, it's embarrassing, in all honesty. No one takes that seriously. So again, what does that mean? Well, if the Quran author is not correcting large swathes of the previous scriptures that he's confirming, because he's perfectly happy to leave them in the state they're in while confirming them, but the Islamic Sunni belief differs and says something different, you're back to square one again. The Quran isn't consciously correcting anything. There's no proof that it is, that the author is even intending to do so, even if you were to grant that it's God who revealed the Quran. There's no evidence anywhere that this is actually happening. All Muslims can do is point to random examples of contradictions and just really hope that they can convince you it's an intentional correction. But keep in mind, intentional correction for them means what? Well, it means re-revealing the original. Because it's not enough that it's just an intentional change, because Muhammad could have said something intentionally different that's just wrong, right? And that's not obviously what they want. What they want is, no, the Quran is from God, and so it's an intentional correction back to the original. Problem, of course, is the Quran author engages with contemporary sources that are not candidates for the original. But why is he doing that if his objective is to re-reveal the original? If you were meant to re-reveal the original, why on earth are you borrowing from all these other sources? Why would you do that? It's because you're not actually trying to re-reveal the original. Finally, just to end this video with something that I think kind of just cuts at the heart of this real quick. You can actually look at the cases where the Quran, and I did this as part of my research for the book, look at the parts of the Quran where it actually gives topics and themes for the kind of things it confirms. Because it actually does in places, even though it's not explicit, because it's in the same context, I think that's enough to warrant that the conclusion is justified, that these themes are being confirmed at the very least. And some of these actually wouldn't even be difficult for a Muslim to accept, because a lot of them they actually already do. So for example, you can look at Surah 6, Ayah 20 and 246, and you'll clearly see that this seems to be some kind of understanding that the Jews and Christians knew Muhammad was prophesied in their books. What would that mean? That would mean that, well, when the Quran is confirming these kind of books, that would mean that in the context of prophecies of Muhammad, or a prophetic context, the prior scriptures are reliable and true. So now we have one category of things being confirmed to be true in the prior scriptures, the Torah and the Gospel at least, that being prophecies. As you can imagine, that's very problematic. But let's continue, because I think there's a lot more, and I think it gets a lot more difficult for them. If we look at Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah 5, Ayah 68 and 69, we notice that 68 is talking about how it is necessary that the Christian and Jew stand on the Torah and the Gospel and all that has come to them from their Lord, which in this context is the Quran. Okay, so that's one of the... You gotta confirm, this is confirming that you have to stand on this. Okay, great. It's not actually a Masadic verse. The Masadic verses will be in 43 to 48 usually in Surah Al-Ma'idah. But 68 does make it very clear. It says, look, you have nothing to stand on unless you stand on the Injil, the Gospel, and the Torah, and the Quran. The very next verse goes on to give a way in which Christians and Jews can be saved, as in they go to Jannah, they go to heaven. That's interesting. Why does that immediately come from the verse telling us we have to follow what's in our Torah and Gospel? I think the answer is very simple. It's because the Quran author envisions that the prior scriptures, the Torah and the Gospel, are sufficient for salvific purposes. He thinks that before the Quran came, Christians and Jews could be saved by following what's in their Torah and what's in their Gospel. That opens up a whole can of worms, ladies and gentlemen. And then finally, I'll give one more. There's a few of these, but I think these are the kind of the main ones that you can have fun with. Surah 12, Ayah 111. So this is actually the last ayah, the last verse in chapter 12, Surah Yusuf. It basically confirms, it says there's a lesson for people of understanding in these stories, and that's usually meant to be the stories of the prophets. It then goes on to say that the Quran is confirming that which is between their hands, or that which is with them. I don't think, given that that's literally in the same verse, that you can separate that. I think that's, if that was the case, I don't understand why Allah didn't do that. Because remember, the verses are given by Allah, so it's not humans that did that, that's God that did that. So if God put all that in one verse, I think he wants you to understand it in the same pericope, in the same context. In which case, we would have to say, yes, this is an entire chapter about Joseph. So we would have to say, yes, the story of Joseph at the very least is something the Quran is confirming. But then, of course, we realize the story of Joseph in Genesis 37 and the story of Joseph in Surah 12 of the Quran are fundamentally not the same story in terms of the details, and hence the Quran has erred when it said it confirmed them. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's just a quick video to go through this. I think this guy may have done another part 2 to this. I might actually check it out. But yeah, ultimately, there's just nothing new here. There's nothing substantive. It's just the same points over and over and over again out of desperation, making the Quran author foolish because he can't communicate properly, rather than just looking at what he's actually said and just reading it honestly. So I hope he becomes more charitable with the text and actually starts to read it as the author intended it, in context and holistically, rather than reading these additional theories into the text that are modern innovations. Like conscious edits, for example. Find me conscious edits in the early ulama. Like, were they calling it conscious edits? No. Was the same idea that one of the main purposes of the Quran is to go through the prior scriptures line by line and just like edit them with the correct info, and then never tell anyone, by the way, that it's done this. I think that's clearly not a scholarly opinion, something that scholars wouldn't take seriously. Clearly the Quran has other kinds of writing in it and not just some weird wacky idea of consciously editing. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you like this video. I will be giving a talk at Wilberforce Academy coming in this early September, if any of you happen to be going to that. I also have some other events that I'll be attending. I'm still in my studies to do with the whole number 19 fiasco, but I look forward to making a video on that very, very soon. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.